Many men and women of violence have been heavily romanticized by people of later eras, their brutal realities smoothed over by the passage of time. Driven by wildly successful pieces of popular culture, such as the Assassin's Creed video game franchise, the popular conception of an assassin has gradually transformed. They have shifted from being viewed as ruthless, terrifying murderers to romanticized renegade anti-heroes, shadowy figures leaping from soaring minarets, killing only because it serves the greater good and protects the innocent. But the true historical foundations of this viewpoint are far more complex, lying within the medieval Islamic realm, which would come to be known as the Nizari Ismaili state. Welcome to our video on how the Nizari defied towering empires to become the most feared assassins of their era, and how they eventually met their apocalyptic end. Almost simultaneously with Islam's meteoric, world-altering rise to superpower status in the 7th century, a deep internal division permanently split the new faith into two opposing and often violently conflicting parties. These were the Sunni, Orthodox Muslims who believed that Abu Bakr's political succession of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 was correct and historically valid, and the Shia, who firmly considered the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, to be the only legitimate, divinely appointed heir, or imam. After a bloody series of civil wars, the Umayyad leader Muawiyah violently took the caliphate from the heirs of Ali. This subsequent generational struggle against central Sunni power fundamentally defined the Shia identity and prompted the splintering of many distinct subgroups with wildly diverging theological viewpoints.
In time, the mighty Umayyads were defeated by the Abbasids in yet another grueling civil war. The golden age of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur served as the grand catalyst for one of these new revolutionary sects, the Ismaili. At some crucial point in his reign, the widely revered 6th Shia Imam, Ja'far al-Sadiq, declared his radical eldest son, Ismail, to be his divinely inspired successor. This was a theological doctrine of designated succession known as Nas. However, his grand plans were disastrously derailed in 762 when Ismail unexpectedly died at the young age of 40, raising incredibly hard questions about who the next true imam should be. When the elderly Ja'far also passed away a few years later, no less than 6 separate groups heavily disputed who the next imam ought to be. 2 of these fragmented groups became the very first Ismaili Shia by fiercely asserting the eternal legitimacy of Ismail despite his physical death, and throwing their unwavering support behind his descendants. In sharp contrast, those who accepted Ismail's younger brother Musa's imamate eventually became known as Twelvers. This is the dominant Shia denomination championed by later Iranian states, stretching from the Safavid Empire all the way to the modern Islamic Republic of Iran.
The early Ismailiyah essentially disappear from the recorded history of the era until around the mid-9th century, when their brilliant, clandestine leaders suddenly burst onto the historical stage. They successfully spread the underground movement to diverse regions across the slowly faltering Abbasid Caliphate, stretching from the deserts of the Maghreb all the way to the mountainous frontiers of Khorasan. Astonishingly, the movement managed to tear away vital, wealthy pieces of the once permanently unified caliphate. A massive Ismaili revolt in the Arabian Peninsula led to the creation of a fascinating religious utopian republic in modern Bahrain under the Karmatian dynasty. Aside from their brutal slaveholding practices, their society was otherwise unusually egalitarian and heavily communal for the medieval age.
However, The absolute crowning achievement of this sectarian revolution was the establishment of Al-Mahdi Billah's majestic Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa. Although the Fatimids only occupied a relatively small and peripheral desert area at first, they managed to hugely increase their global power and prestige in 969 by successfully conquering the wealthy jewel of the Nile, Egypt. Bolstered by that massive economic and strategic victory, the Fatimids boldly entered what prominent historian Farhad Daftari famously dubbed the Ismaili Century. In the 100 prosperous years following Egypt's dramatic fall to the Shia, a rich and incredibly diverse Ismaili literature flourished within the many new vast libraries of Cairo. It blended seamlessly with other ancient philosophical traditions, resulting in incredibly complex, esoteric systems of thought. The Fatimids brilliantly developed complex administrative and financial structures, in addition to re-establishing lucrative, far-flung naval trade routes to India. Along with the accompanying vast riches, spices, and exotic goods, this vibrant cultural exchange also actively spread Ismaili teachings as far east as Gujarat.
However, beginning in the turbulent second half of the 11th century, the once blazing Fatimid star began to rapidly fade as the Shia Caliphate was suddenly faced with insurmountable internal friction and vicious external threats. A devastating dynastic crisis shattered Ismaili unity forever in December 1094, when the long-reigning Fatimid Caliph, Al-Mustansir, passed away. After an incredibly long 58-year reign, it was widely expected by the populace and the court that his highly educated, well-prepared 50-year-old son, Abu Mansur Nizar, would seamlessly inherit the glittering throne in Cairo. But the immensely powerful vizier, Al-Afdal, effectively functioned as a military dictator who controlled the government, and he desperately wanted to retain his absolute personal power.
Upon Al-Mustansir's death, the cunning Al-Afdal quickly organized a ruthless palace coup. He placed Nizar's vastly inexperienced, easily manipulated 20-year-old half-brother, Al-Mustali, on the throne, knowing full well that he could control the young puppet. This blatant usurpation succeeded primarily due to the heavy backing of the Caliphate's standing armies, as well as wealthy religious and court notables who were deeply enthralled to Al-Afdal's purse strings. But the proud Nizar wasn't going to take this insult lightly. He immediately fled the capital to the coastal stronghold of Alexandria, where he was defiantly proclaimed the true caliph by a sympathetic Turkic governor. The local population also fervently supported him, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Nizar's righteous revolt would be a sweeping success. A loyalist Nizarist army fiercely repelled an initial attack by the vizier's troops and even advanced dangerously close to the walls of Cairo. However, Al-Afdal ruthlessly marshaled his vastly superior military and financial resources, brutally besieging Alexandria and successfully starving the city until it led to Nizar's forced surrender in 1095. Soon after, the rightful Fatimid ruler was securely imprisoned and quietly executed by immurement, walled up alive to die of starvation. Most of the terrified Ismaili religious communities in Egypt and Syria eventually bowed their heads and came to terms with this bloody succession. But Persian and other devout adherents in the far Muslim East vehemently refused to bend the knee. They fiercely continued to support the martyred prince's noble house, officially breaking away and becoming the fiercely independent faction known as the Nizari. One highly prominent, utterly brilliant figure of the Nizari Ismaili would soon spearhead their militant movement and legally found what would become legendary as the Assassin's Order, a man named Hasan-i Sabbah. Although he was surprisingly born into a traditional Twelver family in the city of Qom, Iran, at some point around 1050, Hasan had been highly educated in nearby Ray. After initially dismissing the Ismaili doctrine to be nothing more than misguided heresy, he came into contact with a highly persuasive, prominent local Ismaili missionary at the age of 17. Through deep philosophical debate, Hasan was profoundly convinced of the sect's absolute theological legitimacy. To vividly prove his newfound devotion was totally genuine, Hasan swore an oath of unyielding allegiance to al-Mustansir in faraway Cairo. He then courageously traveled to Egypt in 1078 and resided there for 3 incredibly formative years. During his tense time in Fatimid lands, Hasan openly favored the doomed Nizar's faction and actively politicked against the commanding vizier, who at the time was al-Afdal's father. This dangerous political game eventually saw Hasan unceremoniously banished from Egypt in early 1081. Having been thus expelled, the hardened revolutionary returned to Isfahan.
By this time, the once majestic and supposedly invincible Abbasid Caliphate had been all but violently subsumed by the newly arrived, all-conquering Seljuk Turks. These fierce nomadic horseback invaders had rapidly established a massive Sunni military empire which stretched unfettered from Khorasan all the way to the borders of Anatolia. Crucially, they ruthlessly persecuted the Ismaili heretics wherever they found them. In stark, uncompromising opposition to his new, oppressive Seljuk overlords, Hasan traveled the breadth of their vast empire as an undercover missionary for 9 long years. He used this time to quietly gauge their military strength, map their territories, and formulate an unprecedented, asymmetrical strategy of resistance. In 1087, the Ismaili firebrand started covertly dispatching other devout missionaries into the rocky vicinity of a remote, breathtakingly high and nigh invulnerable mountain fortress known as Alamut, the Eagle's Nest. Located in the unforgiving mountainous terrain just south of the Caspian Sea, the goal was to quietly Ismailize the castle's surrounding population and its very garrison. He brilliantly withstood numerous violent Seljuk attempts to brutally stamp out his underground activity, continually managing to remain in hiding. In late 1090, Hasan moved quietly via treacherous, snowy mountainous routes, finally slipping through the heavily guarded gates into Alamut totally unnoticed. He lived completely under the radar as an unassuming religious tutor known as Dikhuda for several tense months, patiently instructing the children of Alamut's garrison and using his unparalleled charisma to slowly turn prominent military figures to his side. Eventually, the castle's Sunni governor suddenly realized the extent of the infiltration, but it was far too late. He had been completely surrounded by his own garrison and a local population who now fervently supported Hasan. Totally incapable of defending himself, the humiliated governor was permitted to peacefully leave the castle with his life. Alamut's bloodless capture was the true beginning of what would become legally and historically known as the Nizari Ismaili state. It also marked the dawn of a terrifying new phase in the Ismailis' relations with the vastly superior Turkic sultans whom they so vehemently opposed. What had previously been a clandestine, secret society-like movement operating in the shadows now became an open, militant revolt aimed directly at the very heart of the Seljuk state, heavily driven by a potent mix of religious sectarianism and deeply rooted Iranian ethnic motivation against Turkic rule.
Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah I and his legendary vizier Nizam al-Mulk were incredibly keen to swiftly extinguish this budding heresy and immediately launched several massive military attacks against the rocky slopes of Alamut. But the imposing castle effortlessly held out against overwhelming military strength. On the contrary, the defiant Nizaris quickly acquired a second lucrative enclave of territory in Quehistan after successfully dispatching their persuasive missionaries to that area. The embattled sect got an incredibly lucky break from the relentless Seljuk attacks in late 1092, when both the mighty Sultan and his fiercely anti-Ismaili vizier died under mysterious circumstances. It is highly possible that the vizier Nizam al-Mulk was the very first high-profile victim of the Nizari assassins, though the historical evidence remains heavily debated. Regardless of who held the blade, the sudden loss of these two titans unexpectedly plunged the massive Seljuk Empire into a chaotic, bloody civil war, essentially fragmenting the vast state into a fractured mosaic of squabbling, independent fiefs ruled by ambitious religious and military leaders.
Hasan ruthlessly capitalized on this chaos to consolidate his precarious position and massively expand Ismaili influence. He quickly acquired other formidable, cloud-piercing strongholds in the jagged Elburz Mountains, chief among them Girdku and Lamasar. Rather than functioning as one contiguous, bordered state, the various isolated citadels of Hasan's sprawling fortress network were almost always entirely surrounded by hostile, well-armed territory. Therefore, the heavily disunited Ismaili mountain castles acted simultaneously as an impenetrable defensive bastion and a highly effective base of operations for proactive religious and military activity. These Eastern Ismaili supposedly received warm congratulations and a formal message of goodwill from Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir, but after his untimely death and the great tragic Ismaili schism of 1094, Hasan completely cut all diplomatic and religious ties with the usurpers in Egypt. Although the Seljuk Empire's post-Malik Shah internal weakness permanently removed the immediate existential threat to Hasan's fledgling Ismaili realm, the extreme political decentralization also made his ultimate grandiose goal, the total sweeping overthrow of the Sunni Seljuks, almost mathematically impossible. There was no longer a single unifying figurehead who could be decisively defeated in a pitched battle and cast from the throne. In effect, there was now no central target, but rather an endless regenerating gallery of petty kings, emirs, and warlords. Surrounded on all sides by far more powerful adversaries, and desperately seeking a new, efficient method of achieving their strategic aims in lieu of fielding a massive standing army, Hasan's Nizari began to meticulously utilize another strategy that had occasionally been used by extreme Shia groups for centuries: targeted assassination. Though political murder was and remains a highly universal method of warfare, the Nizari consciously granted it an increasingly central, almost sacred role in their grand political strategy, knowing full well how incredibly effective it could be as a tool of psychological terror. This sensational part of Nizari history has been wildly distorted over the centuries by external groups who were either deeply hostile to or totally unfamiliar with them and their secretive practices. For example, wild, exaggerated rumors circulated heavily by later Latin Crusader sources recklessly threw the derogatory term Hashashin around to officially designate them. This was primarily due to the probable historical fiction of excessive hashish use being utilized as a mind-altering inspiration to brainwash the killers.
That being said, there does indeed seem to have been what modern scholars might call a cult of assassination, fostered within the high walls of Alamut and the other fortresses. The highly trained Nizari assassins were officially known as Fidai, literally translating to those willing to sacrifice themselves, and they were deeply revered within their communities for their unparalleled bravery, martial prowess, and religious courage. This profound reverence was largely because such daring, close-quarters combat missions were universally considered to be suicidal. The assassin rarely expected to survive the ensuing wrath of the target's bodyguards.
Nizari leaders strategically dispatched their Fidai, who became increasingly professional and lethal, primarily to physically eliminate high-value targets who presented a known existential threat to the Nizari state. This prestigious hit list prominently included Seljuk viziers, high-ranking local emirs, Crusader knights, and prominent Sunni rulers. The Nizaris also brilliantly managed to slowly expand their shadowy influence into the war-torn landscape of Syria around the time of the First Crusade. They successfully captured a few highly strategic fortresses in the Levantine Mountains and began intermingling politically with both the squabbling Seljuk principalities and the newly established Christian Crusader states. Back in Persia, a ruthless warlord named Muhammad Topar aggressively took command of the Seljuk Empire in 1105. He immediately launched a brutal, grinding series of military campaigns against all of the Nizari territories located south of the Caspian Sea. His main, devastating stroke fell heavily on the fortress of Shadiz in 1107, which shockingly fell relatively quickly after a lone Fidai completely failed to properly slay one of the Sultan's commanding viziers.
For well over a dark decade, these relentless Seljuk campaigns against the isolated Nizari continued totally unabated, resulting in horrific, constant massacres and brutal persecution of those Ismaili civilians who could not escape in time to the safety of the mountain castles. Many lesser Nizari fortresses tragically fell under the massive weight of the siege engines. But finally, when the Seljuks were dangerously on the verge of finally breaching Alamut itself in April 1118, Muhammad Topar abruptly died of illness, and the crushing military pressure instantly waned. This narrow escape was the definite beginning of a totally new phase in the bloody Nizari-Seljuk relations, one defined primarily by a tense, unbreakable stalemate born out of sheer mutual exhaustion. Scores of innocent Ismailis had been mercilessly slain in the sprawling cities, deeply damaging the movement's urban support base. Hassan's incredible 3-decade-long anti-Seljuk revolt, in which an unrecognized state, completely lacking a real field army, had miraculously survived and consistently inflicted terrifying psychological damage on a giant military empire, had ultimately failed to topple the regime. Yet, the Nizari state was miraculously still a cohesive, functioning entity. From that pivotal point onward, the Nizari focus would decisively turn toward internal defense and quiet consolidation. The deliberate transformation of the radical Nizari state into a permanent, enduring political entity. Hassan's personal attention gracefully turned toward pious, scholarly pursuits, writing and attempting to foster peaceful relations with his neighbors. Though, importantly, this peace was often effectively achieved by highly illicit and terrifying means. For a famous example, Hasan once received alarming intelligence reports that a powerful Seljuk ruler named Ahmad Sanjar was actively planning a massive military campaign against Alamut. Allegedly, that very monarch woke up one calm morning in his heavily guarded royal tent to shockingly find a razor-sharp Nizari dagger thrust deeply into the hard ground right next to his bed. It was accompanied by a chillingly polite note, calmly stating that Hasan-i Sabbah would very much like to have peace. Deeply shocked and no doubt absolutely terrified that his innermost guards had been compromised, Sanjar gave the fearsome Nizaris no further trouble for the rest of his life. He even went so far as promoting a relatively tolerant attitude toward them and bizarrely granting Alamut 4,000 gold dinars per year as an official royal pension. The looming, invisible threat of assassination clearly worked just as well as the bloody deed itself, at least for as long as the brilliant Hasan was alive. However, the legendary Nizari leader eventually fell terribly ill in 1124 and prudently designated his rightful successor, formally appointing a wise council of loyal advisors to strictly guide him in the heavy role. In that same year, the old visionary quietly passed away deep inside the walls of Alamut at the venerable age of 70. Having astonishingly never once physically left the mighty citadel for an incredible 34 years.
An effective, bloody stalemate continued for long, tense decades following his death. Often, the Nizari stationed in Persia or Syria would successfully capture a towering fortress by stealth, only to predictably have another one violently taken from them by a massive Sunni army. There were fleeting periods of uneasy peace, as well as those of chaotic, intermittent warfare. Throughout all of this turbulence, the mountain strongholds of Hasan's resilient movement remained incredibly cohesive, deeply fanatical, and highly organized. In 1162, a truly remarkable, enigmatic man named Rashid al-Din Sinan was formally dispatched from Persia to actively lead the burgeoning Syrian branch of the Nizari, who had steadily grown in regional influence in the turbulent half-century since they first penetrated deeply into the Levant. Despite being geographically far removed from one another territorially, the various isolated Nizari enclaves all faithfully took their absolute orders from the supreme central leadership operating in Alamut. This brilliant Syrian appointee would later become legendary to the West, immortalized as the mythical Old Man of the Mountain in the wildly popular, embellished travel tales of the European explorer Marco Polo. Sinan immediately delved fearlessly into the ever-shifting, dangerous interfaith web of political alliances in Crusader-era Syria. Eventually, he boldly sent multiple highly trained fidayis to assassinate an incredibly famous, up-and-coming Muslim leader who aggressively sought to unify the fractured region against the Crusaders, the legendary Saladin. Incredibly, the elite Nizari killers miraculously failed twice to end the mighty Sultan's life. Once, they were caught after bravely invading the Ayyubid ruler's heavily fortified military encampment, and once they violently struck during his chaotic siege of Azaz, only to be thwarted by Saladin's armor. Sinan's imposing Syrian headquarters at the castle of Masyaf was
furiously besieged by Saladin's massive army in immediate response to the hits. But due to its incredible defenses and terrifying reputation, it did not fall. Ultimately, a tense, mutually respectful compromise was eventually reached between the two great men, and Saladin chose to leave the assassins in peace rather than risk a dagger in the dark. One of the most absolutely notorious, world-shaking assassinations of Sinan's entire long rule boldly occurred during the chaotic closing stages of the momentous Third Crusade. A bitter, highly toxic royal rivalry had existed between King Philip Augustus of France and King Richard the Lionheart of England since the Holy Venture's very early stages, which stubbornly prompted both proud men to politically support completely different noble candidates for the highly contested crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Much to King Richard's burning anger and supreme frustration, the highly competent, universally respected Conrad of Montferrat was unanimously elected by the Crusader barons to take the throne of Jerusalem. However, the ambitious prospective monarch would tragically never live to be crowned. At noon on a sunny April 28th, 1192, the proud Frankish Crusader lord was casually returning home from having a pleasant lunch with his close, trusted friend, the Bishop of Beauvais, accompanied only by a few heavily armed guards. On his casual walk through the narrow streets, Conrad was suddenly approached by two humble-looking Christian monks whom he had inexplicably become highly familiar with in recent days. A polite, engaging conversation began between the two parties, putting Conrad's seasoned guards completely at ease with the seemingly innocuous, pious men. At that exact moment of his greatest blinding vulnerability, the monks suddenly sprang forward with hidden, poisoned daggers, brutally and mercilessly stabbing the shocked king-elect with at least 2 fatal blows squarely to his side and back. Although the ruthless assassins, who were of course disguised fidei, personally dispatched by Rashid al-Din Sinan, were immediately either killed by the guards or captured and tortured to death, Conrad's fate was sealed. He either died instantly on the bloody cobblestones from his grievous wounds, or passed away shortly after being frantically taken to a nearby church. Various complex political motivations and shadowy culprits have been confidently designated for ordering the spectacular murder. The temperamental Richard the Lionheart was widely accused by his European enemies because of his highly public enmity towards Conrad. Meanwhile, a suspicious letter allegedly sent to Austria's Leopold V formally detailed Conrad's unforgivable prior murder of a helpless, shipwrecked Nizari crew off the coast of Tyre as the sole righteous cause of his bloody death. Whatever the absolute historical truth of the case, this incredibly high-profile killing only further cemented the mythical, terrifying European vision of mysterious, unstoppable Eastern assassins who completely lacked the basic human fear of death. These later, bloody decades of the late 12th century marked a shining, undeniable high point in the power of the Syrian Nizaris in particular, a golden period that came to a quiet end when the legendary Rashid al-Din Sinan peacefully died of old age at his fortress of Masyaf in 1193. The 13th century was now violently dawning, and for the isolated Ismailis, it would bring the terrifying equivalent of a total biblical apocalypse. At the bloody beginning of the 13th century, the unstoppable, continent-spanning Mongol juggernaut rolled relentlessly through the entire Islamic world, totally crushing all ancient empires and proud kingdoms in its destructive path. The great Mongol Khans became highly famous for their pragmatic utilization of talented, educated native peoples recruited from the vast lands they violently conquered. This newly formed imperial bureaucracy apparently included a large number of deeply resentful Sunni courtiers who utterly despised the Ismaili heretics with a burning passion. They must have excitedly informed the Mongols of the Nizari's legendary reputation for stubborn, mountainous defiance, in addition to their horrific, long-standing penchant for political assassination. Perhaps after creatively adding a few more fanciful, terrifying details to the legends, these chilling tales must have greatly concerned the Supreme Khan, who pragmatically viewed such an uncontrollable, fanatical cult as an unacceptable security risk to his absolute global rule. After initial, somewhat lukewarm diplomatic relations, the sitting Nizari ruler, Muhammad III of Alamut, received a truly dreadful, terrifying shock in the year 1246. Upon the grand political ascension of Ogadei Khan's successor, Guyuk, many terrified Muslim leaders frantically sent lavish embassies bearing immense wealth, congratulations, and exotic gifts to appease the new great Khan. Out of all of them, only the brave Nizari ambassadors were harshly, humiliatingly dismissed from the Mongol court. To aggressively back up this incredibly hostile diplomatic stance, the ruthless Khan openly proclaimed that out of every 10 armed reinforcements he would logically send to the front lines in Persia, 2 absolute must be directly used to violently reduce rebellious fortified lands, most prominently those of the hated Ismaili.
This was a brutal policy of extermination that Guyuk's ambitious successor, Möngke, who aggressively desired the complete, total, and unquestioned domination of Western Asia, happily mimicked. Despite fiercely offering ferocious, desperate resistance from their high mountain peaks, the crushing Mongol military pressure was simply far too great for the small state to withstand. On the dark day of November 19th, 1256, the final, completely overwhelmed Nizari Imam, Kursha, was tragically forced to surrender the supposedly impregnable keys of Alamut to the fearsome Mongol warlord Hulagu Khan, and was initially shown a brief modicum of fake mercy. After being heavily escorted in chains far from his ancestral lands, however, the deposed Imam was unceremoniously, brutally executed in the remote Kongai Mountains. Back in shattered Persia, the towering stone walls of the captured Nizari fortresses were systematically torn down to the bedrock by Mongol engineers. Vast, irreplaceable libraries containing centuries of Ismaili knowledge and esoteric philosophy were mindlessly torched, and many thousands of defenseless Ismaili civilians were systematically slaughtered. One by one, the isolated mountain strongholds violently fell to the siege engines, with their remaining fidais bravely putting up a desperate, suicidal fight to the bitter, bloody end. The very final Ismaili castle of Gerdku incredibly held out for years, but finally collapsed on December 15th, 1270. The violently absolute, fiery destruction of Hasan-i Sabbah's once proud Alamut-based state officially put a permanent end to independent Nizari statehood forever. Yet, against all the monumental odds of history, the resilient Nizari faith did survive into the modern day. Currently,
They are a thriving global community led peacefully by their 49th hereditary imam, Aga Khan IV, who leads them from the sunny Portuguese capital of Lisbon, boasting an estimated 15 million devoted followers spread across more than 25 different countries. Although these modern Nizaris are far less militant and instead focus heavily on global charity, education, and peace, the incredible, dramatic story of their fiercely independent, self-sacrificing medieval predecessors continues to shine brightly and proudly in their cultural memories. We always have more fascinating, epic stories to tell from the annals of history, so please make sure you are actively subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button to never miss an update. This is Lost Ages Channel, and we will catch you on the next one.